The Capture of Cerberus, and the Incident of the Dog's Ball, by Agatha Christie. Read by David Suchet. The Capture of Cerberus, The Labours of Hercules 12. Part 1. Hercule Poirot sipped his aperitif and looked out across the Lake of Geneva. He sighed. He had spent his morning talking to certain diplomatic personages, all in a state of high agitation, and he was tired. For he had been unable to offer them any comfort in their difficulties. The world was in a very disturbed state, every nation alert and tense. At any minute the blow might fall, and Europe once more be plunged into war. Hercule Poirot sighed. He remembered 1914 only too well. He had no illusions about war. It settled nothing. The peace it brought in its wake was usually only the peace of exhaustion, not a constructive peace. He thought sadly to himself, if only a man could arise who would set enthusiasm for peace flaming through the world, as men have aroused enthusiasm for victory and conquest by force. Then he reflected with Latin common sense that these ideas of his were unprofitable. They accomplished nothing. To arouse enthusiasm was not his gift, and never had been. Brains, he thought, with his usual lack of modesty, were his speciality. And men with great brains were seldom great leaders or great orators, possibly because they were too astute to be taken in by themselves. Ah, well, one must be a philosopher, said Hercule Poirot to himself. The deluge, it has not yet arrived. In the meantime, this aperitif is good, the sun shines, the lake is blue, and the orchestra plays not badly. Is that not enough? But he felt that it was not. He thought with a sudden smile, there is one little thing needed to complete the harmony of the passing moment. A woman, une femme du monde, chic, well-dressed, sympathetic, spirituelle. There were many beautiful and well-dressed women round him, but to Hercule Poirot they were subtly unsatisfactory. He demanded more ample curves, a richer, more flamboyant appeal. And even as his eyes roamed in dissatisfaction round the terrace, he saw what he had been hoping to see. A woman at a table nearby, a woman so full of flamboyant form, her luxuriant henna-red hair crowned by a small round of black to which was attached a positive platoon of brilliantly feathered little birds. The woman turned her head. Her eyes rested casually on Poirot, then opened. Her vivid scarlet mouth opened too. She rose to her feet, ignoring her companion at the table, and with all the impulsiveness of her Russian nature, she surged towards Hercule Poirot, a galleon in full sail. Her hands were outstretched, her rich voice boomed out. "Ah, but it is, mon cher Hercule Poirot, after how many years? We will not say how many. It is unlucky." Poirot rose to his feet. He bent his head gallantly over the Countess Vera Rosakoff's hand. It is the misfortune of small, precise men to hanker after large and flamboyant women. Poirot had never been able to rid himself of the fatal fascination the Countess had for him. Now, it was true, the Countess was far from young. Her make-up resembled a sunset, her eyelashes dripped with mascara. The original woman underneath the make-up had long been hidden from sight. Nevertheless, to Hercule Poirot, she still represented the sumptuous, the alluring. The bourgeois in him was thrilled by the aristocrat. The old fascination stole over him. He remembered the adroit way in which he had stolen jewellery on the occasion of their first meeting, and the magnificent aplomb with which he admitted the fact when taxed with it. He said, "Madame, enchantée," and sounded as though the phrase were more than a commonplace politeness. The Countess sat down at his table. She cried,
Oh, you are here in Geneva. Why? To hunt down some wretched criminal? Ah, if so, he has no chance against you, none at all. You are the man who always wins. There is no one like you, no one in the world.
If Hercule Poirot had been a cat, he would have purred. As it was, he twirled his moustaches.
And you, madame? What is it that you do here?
She laughed. She said,
I am not afraid of you. For once I am on the side of the angels. I lead here the most virtuous of existences. I endeavour to amuse myself, but everyone is very dull. N'est-ce pas?
The man who had been sitting with the Countess at a table had come over and stood hesitating beside them. The Countess looked up.
Oh, bon Dieu, she exclaimed. I forgot you. Let me present you. Herr Dr. Kaiserbach, and this is the most marvellous man in the world, Monsieur Hercule Poirot.
The tall man with the brown beard and the keen blue eyes clicked his heels and bowed. He said,
I have heard of you, Monsieur Poirot.
Countess Vera overbore Poirot's polite rejoinder. She cried,
But you cannot possibly know how wonderful he is. He knows everything. He can do anything. Murderers hang themselves to save time when they know he is on their track. He is a genius, I tell you. He never fails.
Oh, no, madame. Do not say that.
Oh, but it is true. Do not be modest. It is stupid to be modest.
She turned to the other man.
I tell you, he can do miracles. He can even bring the dead back to life.
Something leapt, a startled flash, into the blue eyes behind the glasses. Herr Kaiserbach said,
So?
Hercule Poirot said, By the way, madame, how is your son?
Oh, the beloved angel, so big now, such shoulders, so handsome. He is in America. He builds there. Bridges, banks, hotels, department stores, railways, anything the Americans want.
Poirot looked slightly puzzled. He murmured, He is then an engineer or an architect?
Oh, what does it matter?
Demanded the Countess Rossakoff.
He is adorable. He is wrapped up in iron girders and things called stresses. The kind of things I have never understood nor cared about. But we adore each other.
Herr Kaiserbach took his leave. He asked of Poirot,
You are staying here, Monsieur Paul? Good. Then we may meet again.
Poirot asked the lady, You will have an aperitif with me?
Yes, we will drink vodka together and be very gay.
The idea seemed to Hercule Poirot a good one. Part 2. It was on the following evening that Dr. Kaiserbach invited Hercule Poirot to his rooms. They sipped a fine brandy together and indulged in a little desultory conversation together. Then Kaiserbach said, I was interested, Monsieur Poirot, by something that our charming friend said about you yesterday. Yes?
She used these words. He can even bring the dead back to life.
Hercule Poirot sat up a little in his chair. His eyebrows rose. He said, That interests you?
Very much.
Why?
Because I feel those words may have been an omen.
Hercule Poirot said sharply, Are you asking me to bring the dead to life?
Perhaps. What would you say if I did?
Hercule Poirot shrugged his shoulders. He said, After all, death is death, monsieur.
Not always.
Hercule Poirot's eyes grew sharp and green. He said, You want me to bring a person who is dead to life again?
A man or a woman? A man.
Who is it?
You do not appear appalled by the task?
Poirot smiled faintly. He said,
You are not mad. You are a sane and reasonable individual. Bringing the dead to life is a phrase susceptible of many meanings. It may be treated figuratively or symbolically.
The other said,
In a minute you will understand. To begin with, my name is not Kaiserbach. I adopted that name so that I should pass unnoticed. My own name is too well known. That is, it has been too well known for the last month. Lotzmann.
He spoke it significantly. His eyes searched Poirot closely. Poirot said sharply, "Lutzmann?" He paused and then said in a different tone, "Hans Lutzmann?" The other man said in a hard, dry voice,
"Hans Lutzmann was my son."
Part 3. If, a month previously, you had asked any Englishman who was responsible for the general condition of European unrest, the reply would almost inevitably have been Herzlein. There was, it was true, also Bondolini, but it was upon August Herzlein that popular imagination fastened. He was the dictator of dictators. His warlike utterances had rallied the youth of his own country and of allied countries. It was he who had set Central Europe ablaze, and kept it ablaze. On the occasion of his public speeches, he was able to set huge crowds rocking with frenzied enthusiasm. His high, strangely tuned voice had a power all its own. People in the know explained learnedly how Herzlein was not really the supreme power in the Central Empires. They mentioned other names, Goldsam, von Emmen. These, they said, were the executive brains. Herzlein was only the figurehead. Nevertheless, it continued to be Herzlein who loomed in the public eye. Hopeful rumours went about. Herzlein had an incurable cancer. He could not live longer than 6 months. Herzlein had valvular disease of the heart. He might drop down dead any day. Herzlein had had 1 stroke already, and might have another any moment. Herzlein, after violently persecuting the Catholic Church, had been converted by the famous Bavarian monk Father Ludwig. He would shortly enter a monastery. Herzlein had fallen in love with a Russian Jewess, the wife of a doctor. He was going to leave the Central Empires and settle down with her in Sweden. And in spite of all the rumours, Herzlein neither had a stroke, nor died of cancer, nor went into a monastery, nor eloped with a Russian Jewess. He continued to make rousing speeches amidst scenes of the greatest enthusiasm, and at judicious intervals he added various territories to the Central Empires. And daily the shadow of war grew darker over Europe. Desperately, people repeated all the hopeful rumours even more hopefully, or demanded fiercely, "Why doesn't someone assassinate him? If only he were out of the way!" There came a peaceful week, when Herzlein made no public utterances, and when hopes of each of the separate rumours increased tenfold. And then, on a fateful Thursday, Herr Herzlein addressed a monster meeting of the Brothers of Youth. People said afterwards that his face was drawn and strained, that even his voice held a different note, that there was about him a prescience of what was to come. But there are always people who say such things afterwards. The speech began much as usual. Salvation would come through sacrifice and through the force of arms. Men must die for their country. If not, they were unworthy to live for it. The democratic nations were afraid of war, cowardly, unworthy to survive. Let them go, be swept away by the glorious force of the young. Fight, fight, and again fight for victory and to inherit the earth. Herzlein, in his enthusiasm, stepped out from behind his bullet-proof shelter. Immediately a shot rang out, and the great dictator fell, a bullet through his head. In the third rank of the listening people, a young man was literally torn to pieces by the mob, the smoking pistol still grasped in his hand. That young man was a student named Hans Lutzmann. For a few days, the hopes of the democratic world rose high. The dictator was dead. Now, perhaps, the reign of peace would come. That hope died almost immediately, for the dead man became a symbol, a martyr, a saint. Those moderates whom he had failed to sway living, he swayed dead. A great wave of warlike enthusiasm swept over the Central Empires. Their leader had been killed, but his dead spirit should lead them on. The Central Empires should dominate the world and sweep away democracy. With dismay, the peace lovers realized that Herzlein's death had accomplished nothing. Rather, it had hastened the evil day. Lutzmann's act had accomplished less than nothing. Part 4. The dry, middle-aged voice said, "Hans Lutzmann was my son." Poirot said, "I do not yet understand you. Your son killed Herzlein?" He stopped. The other was slowly shaking his head. He said, "My son did not kill Herzlein. He and I did not think alike. I tell you, he loved that man. He worshipped him. He believed in him. He would never have drawn a pistol against him. He was a Nazi through and through, in all his young enthusiasm." "Then if not, who did?" The elder Lutzmann said, "That is what I want you to find out." Hercule Poirot said, "You have an idea?" Lutzmann said hoarsely, "I may be wrong." Hercule Poirot said steadily, "Tell me what you think." Kaiserbach leaned forward. Part 5. Dr. Otto Schultz readjusted his tortoiseshell-rimmed glasses. His thin face beamed with scientific enthusiasm. He said in pleasant nasal accents, "I guess, Mr. Poirot, that with what you've told me, I'll be able to go right ahead." "You have the schedule?" "Why, certainly. I shall work to it very carefully. As I see it, perfect timing is essential to the success of your plan." Hercule Poirot bestowed a glance of approval. He said, "Order and method. That is the pleasure of dealing with a scientific mind." Dr. Schultz said, "You can count on me." And wringing him warmly by the hand, he went out. Part 6. George, Poirot's invaluable manservant, came softly in. He inquired in a low, deferential voice, "Will there be any more gentlemen coming, sir?" "No, George, that was the last of them." Hercule Poirot looked tired. He'd been very busy since he'd returned from Bavaria the week before. He leaned back in his chair and shaded his eyes with his hand. He said, "When all this is over, I shall go for a long rest." "Yes, sir. I think that would be advisable, sir." Poirot murmured, "The last Labour of Hercules. Do you know, George, what that was?" "I couldn't say, I'm sure, sir. I don't vote Labour myself." Poirot said, "Those young men that you have seen here today, I have sent them on a special mission. They have gone to the place of departed spirits. In this Labour there can be no force employed. All must be done by guile." "Well, they seemed very competent-looking gentlemen, if I may say so, sir." Hercule Poirot said, "I chose them very carefully." He sighed and shook his head. He said, "The world is very sick." George said, "It looks like war, whichever way you turn. Everybody's very depressed, sir, and as for trade, it's just awful. We can't go on like this." Hercule Poirot murmured, "We sit in the twilight of the gods." Part 7. Dr. Schultz paused before a property surrounded by a high wall. It was situated about 8 miles from Strasbourg. He rang the gate bell. In the distance he heard the deep baying of a dog and the rattle of a chain. The gatekeeper appeared, and Dr. Otto Schultz presented his card. "I wish to see the Herr Dr. Weingartner." "Oh, alas, monsieur, the doctor has been called away only an hour ago by telegram." Schultz frowned. "Can I then see his second-in-command?" "Dr. Neumann? But certainly." Dr. Neumann was a pleasant-faced young man with an ingenious, open countenance. Dr. Schultz produced his credentials. A letter of introduction from one of the leading alienists in Berlin. He himself, he explained, was the author of a publication dealing with certain aspects of lunacy and mental degeneracy. The other's face lighted up, and he replied that he knew Dr. Schultz's publications and was very much interested in his theories. What a regrettable thing that Dr. Weingartner should be absent. The two men began to talk shop, comparing conditions in America and Europe, and finally becoming technical. They discussed individual patients. Schultz recounted some recent results of a new treatment for paranoia. He said with a laugh, "And by that means we have cured 3 Herzleins, 4 Bondolinis, 5 President Roosevelts, and 7 Supreme Deities." Neumann laughed. Presently the two men went upstairs and visited the wards. It was a small mental home for private patients. There were only about 12 occupants. Schultz said, "You understand I'm principally interested in your paranoid cases. I believe you have a case admitted quite recently which has some peculiarly interesting features." Part 8. Poirot looked from the telegram lying on his desk to the face of his visitor. The telegram consisted simply of an address, Villa Eugénie, Strasbourg. It was followed by the words, "Beware of the dog." The visitor was an odoriferous gentleman of middle age with a red and swollen nose, an unshaven chin, and a deep, husky voice which seemed to rise from his unprepossessing-looking boots. He said hoarsely, "Oh, you can trust me, Governor. Do anything with dogs I can." "So I have been told, and it will be necessary for you to travel to France, to Alsace." Mr. Higgs looked interested. "That where them Alsatian dogs come from? Never been out of England, I haven't. England's good enough for me, that's what I say." Poirot said, "You will need a passport." He produced a form. "Now fill this up. I will assist you." They went laboriously through it. Mr. Higgs said, "I had me photo took, as you said. Well, not that I like the idea of that much. That might be dangerous in my profession." Mr. Higgs's profession was that of a dog-stealer, but that fact was glossed over in the conversation. "Your photograph," said Poirot, "will be signed on the back by a magistrate, a clergyman, or a public official who will vouch for you as being a proper person to have a passport." A grin overspread Mr. Higgs's face. "Oh, that's rare, that is," he said. "That's rare. A beak saying as I'm a fit and proper person to have a passport." Hercule Poirot said, "In desperate times, one must use desperate means." "Meaning me?" said Mr. Higgs. "You and your colleague." They started for France 2 days later. Poirot, Mr. Higgs, and a slim young man in a checked suit and a bright pink shirt, who was a highly successful cat burglar. Part 9. It was not Hercule Poirot's custom to indulge in activities in his proper person, but for once he broke through his rule. It was past 1 in the morning when, shivering slightly in spite of his overcoat, he was laboriously hoisted to the top of a wall by the help of his 2 assistants. Mr. Higgs prepared to drop from the wall into the grounds inside. There was a violent baying of a dog, and suddenly an enormous creature rushed out from under the trees. Hercule Poirot ejaculated,
"Mon Dieu, but it is a monster! Are you sure?"
Mr. Higgs patted his pocket with complete assurance. "Don't you worry, Governor. What I've got here is the right stuff. Any dog will follow me to hell for it."
"In this case," murmured Hercule Poirot, "he has to follow you out of hell."
"Same thing," said Mr. Higgs, and dropped off the wall into the garden. They heard his voice. "Here you are, Fido. Have a sniff of this." "That's right. Now you come along with me." His voice died away into the night. The garden was dark and peaceful. The slim young man assisted Poirot down from the wall. They came to the house. Poirot said, "That is the window there, the second to the left." The young man nodded. He examined the wall first, smiled in satisfaction over a convenient pipe, and then easily and seemingly without effort he disappeared up the wall. Presently, very faintly, Poirot heard the sound of a file being used on the barred window. Time passed. Then something dropped at Poirot's feet. It was the end of a silk ladder. Someone was coming down the ladder. A short man with a bullet head and a little dark moustache. He came down slowly and clumsily. At last he reached the ground. Hercule Poirot stepped forward into the moonlight. He said politely, "Herr Herzlein, I presume?" Part 10. Herzlein said,
"How did you find me?"
They were in the compartment of a second-class sleeper bound for Paris. Poirot, as was his fashion, answered the question meticulously. He said, "At Geneva I became acquainted with a gentleman called Lutzmann. It was his son who was supposed to have fired the shot that killed you, and as a result young Lutzmann was torn to death by the crowd. His father, however, was firmly convinced that his son had never fired that shot, and it seemed therefore as though Herr Herzlein had been shot by one of the two men who were on either side of Lutzmann, and that the pistol was forced into his hand, and those two men had fallen upon him at once, crying out that he was the murderer. But there was another point. Lutzmann assured me that in these mass meetings the front ranks were always packed with ardent supporters, that is to say, by thoroughly trustworthy persons. Now, the Central Empire administration is very good. Its organization is so perfect that it seems incredible that such a disaster could have occurred. Moreover, there were two small but significant points. Herzlein, at the critical moment, came out from his bulletproof shelter, and his voice had sounded different that evening. Appearance is nothing. It would be easy for someone to carry out an impersonation on a public platform, but the subtle intonation of a voice is a thing more difficult to copy. That evening, Herr Herzlein's voice had lacked its usual intoxicating quality. It was hardly noticed because he was shot only a very few minutes after he had started to speak. Suppose, then, that it was not Herr Herzlein speaking, and consequently not Herr Herzlein who had been shot. Could there be a theory that would account for those very extraordinary happenings? I thought that was possible. Amongst all the various rumors that circulate in a time of stress, there is usually a foundation of truth beneath at least one of them. Supposing that rumor was true, that declared that Herzlein had lately fallen under the influence of that fervent preacher, Father Ludwig. Poirot went on, speaking slowly. I thought it possible, Excellency, that you, a man of ideals, a visionary, might have come suddenly to realize that a new vista, a vista of peace and brotherhood, was open to humanity, and that you were the man to set their feet upon that path. Herzlein nodded violently. He said in his soft, husky, thrilling voice, You are right. The scales fell from my eyes. Father Ludwig was the appointed means to show me my true destiny. Peace. Peace is what the world wants. We must lead youth forward to live in brotherhood. The youth of the world must join together to plan a great campaign, a campaign of peace. And I shall lead them. I am the means appointed by God to give peace to the world. The compelling voice ceased. Hercule Poirot nodded to himself, registering, with interest, his own aroused emotion. He went on dryly. Unfortunately, Excellency, this vast project of yours did not please certain executive authorities in the Central Empires. On the contrary, it filled them with dismay.
Because they knew that where I led, the people would follow.
Exactly. So they kidnapped you without more ado. But they were then in a dilemma. If they gave out that you were dead, awkward questions might arise. Too many people would be in the secret. And also with you dead, the warlike emotions you had aroused might die with you. They hit instead upon a spectacular end. A man was prevailed upon to represent you at the monster meeting.
Perhaps Schwartz. He took my place sometimes in public processions.
Possibly. He himself had no idea of the end planned for him. He thought only that he was to read a speech because you yourself were ill. He was instructed at a given moment to step out from the bulletproof shelter, to show how completely he trusted his people. He never suspected any danger, but the 2 stormtroopers had their orders. One of them shot him, and the 2 of them fell on the young man standing between them and cried out that it was his hand that had fired the shot. They knew their crowd's psychology. The result was as they had hoped, a frenzy of national patriotism and a rigid adherence to the program of force by arms. Herzlein said, "But you still do not tell me how you found me." Hercule Poirot smiled. "Well, that was easy, for a person that is of my mental capacity. Granted that they had not killed you, and I did not think that they could kill you, some day you might be useful to them alive, especially if they could prevail upon you to readopt your former views. Where could they take you? Out of the Central Empires? But not too far. And there was only one place where you could be safely hidden, in an asylum or a mental home. The place where a man might declare tirelessly all day and all night that he was Herr Herzlein, and where such a statement would be accepted as quite natural. Paranoics are always convinced that they are great men. In every mental institution there are Napoleons, Herzleins, Julius Caesars, often many examples of Le Bon Dieu himself. I decided that you would most probably be in a small institution in Alsace or Lorraine, where German-speaking patients would be natural, and probably only one person would be in the secret, the medical director himself. To discover where you were, I enlisted the services of some 5 or 6 bona fide medical men. These men obtained letters of introduction from an eminent alienist in Berlin. At each institution they visited, the director was, by a curious coincidence, called away by telegram about an hour before the visitor's arrival. One of my agents, an intelligent young American doctor, was allotted the Villa Eugenie, and when visiting the paranoid patients, he had little difficulty in recognizing the genuine article when he saw you. For the rest, you know it." Herzlein was silent a moment. Then he said, and his voice held once again that moving and appealing note,
"You have done a greater thing than you know. This is the beginning of peace. Peace over Europe. Peace in all the world. It is my destiny to lead mankind to peace and brotherhood."
Hercule Poirot said softly, "Amen to that." Part 11. Hercule Poirot sat on the terrace of a hotel in Geneva. A pile of newspapers lay beside him. Their headlines were big and black. The amazing news had run like wildfire all over the world. Herzlein is not dead. There had been rumors, announcements, counter-announcements, violent denials by the Central Empire governments. And then, in the great public square of the capital city, Herzlein had spoken to a vast mass of people, and there had been no doubt possible. The voice, the magnetism, the power. He had played upon them until he had them crying out in a frenzy. They had gone home shouting their new catchwords: peace, love, brotherhood. The young are to save the world. There was a rustle beside Poirot and the smell of an exotic perfume. Countess Vera Russakoff plumped down beside him. She said,
"Oh, is it real? Can it work?"
"Why not?
Can there be such a thing as brotherhood in men's hearts?"
Well, there can be the belief in it." She nodded thoughtfully. She said,
Yes, I see."
Then, with a quick gesture, she said,
"But they won't let him go on with it. They'll kill him, really kill him this time."
Poirot said, "But his legend, the new legend, will live after him. Death is never an end." Vera Russakoff said,
"Poor Hans Lutzmann."
"His death was not useless either." Vera Russakoff said,
"You are not afraid of death, I see. I am. I do not want to talk about it. Let us be gay, and sit in the sun and drink vodka."
"Very willingly, madame. The more so since we have now got hope in our hearts." He added, "I have a present for you, if you will deign to accept it."
"A present for me? But how charming!"
"Excuse me a moment." Hercule Poirot went into the hotel. He came back a few seconds later. He brought with him an enormous dog of singular ugliness. The Countess clapped her hands.
"What a monster! How adorable! I like everything large, immense. Never have I seen such a big dog. And he is for me?"
"If it pleases you to accept him."
"I shall adore him."
She snapped her fingers. The large hound laid a trusting muzzle in her hand.
"See, he is as gentle as a lamb with me. He is like the big fierce dogs we had in Russia in my father's house."
Poirot stood back a little. His head went on one side. Artistically he was pleased. The savage dog, the flamboyant woman. Yes, the tableau was perfect. The Countess inquired,
"What is his name?"
Hercule Poirot replied with the sigh of one whose labours are completed. "Call him Cerberus." The Capture of Cerberus, The Labours of Hercules 12, by Agatha Christie, was read by David Suchet.